Hello everyone, I'm Tamara Banks. Welcome to this edition of Dialogue Denver D.A. And Mitch, always great to see you.
Good to see you, Tamara.
Thanks for having me host this with you every month. We've got some really special guests with us today. We've got Crime Victim Compensation Director Linda Ferry. Thank you for being here. And Andi Martin with the Colorado Division of Criminal Justice. Thank you for being here too, Andi. Why don't we start with just a basic question of the victim compensation in general. Is there an application for it, and who's eligible?
There is an application for it, and it's a program that's defined in statute. So people are eligible for the program that I run, which is just for the city and county of Denver. If the crime happened in Denver, if the person reported to the police, if the person cooperated with the investigation of the police, of the incident with the police, and if they were the victim of a crime against person, we don't work with property crimes. Under those circumstances, there's an application. It's fairly direct, fairly straightforward, and we need that information in order to proceed with open a claim, so we call it, and we proceed with the claim.
Now, is this information that a victim receives when they start to report their crime against them?
The victims get information from a lot of different places, but certainly the Victim Assistance Unit, the police department, is one of the main referring agencies to us. Private nonprofits refer, the hospitals sometimes refer. So we've tried to educate the community pretty broadly, because the point is, after all, to spend the money and to get victims engaged. So they get referrals from a number of different sources.
So you mentioned it's not crimes against property, but really crimes against an individual.
Correct.
What are some of the services that you can help with?
Our biggest expenditure traditionally has been with medical bills, to assist with hospital bills, ambulance bills, that kind of thing. We assist with mental health therapy. We can assist with lost wages if a person was injured and can't return to work for a period of time. And of course, unfortunately, we also assist with burial costs when those become an issue in the case of a homicide or a traffic fatality.
Mm-hmm. And so where does that money come from?
There's some poetic justice in this. The money comes from fines that are assessed on people who commit crimes in this judicial district. So felonies, misdemeanors, and some traffic offenses carry as part of the sentence a fine, and that is put into the fund for crime victims. It becomes the Crime Victim Compensation Fund. And then we get some money from the federal government through the Victim of Crime Act fund at the federal level. So it's all money paid into a fund by offenders.
And Mitch, I imagine this is important. Of course, your department is focused on, prosecuting people, but then people just need to know not only is this person maybe going to jail, but they may also be reimbursed for some of their losses.
Yeah, there's two ways in the system that somebody gets reimbursed, and part of it is the Victim Compensation Fund, and that can happen a lot more quickly than if we wait for the case to work its way through the system. If you think about it, a murder case may take us a couple of years to get through the system. And so what happens is Linda can help right away, get the hospital off somebody's back with medical bills, those kinds of things, and can help. And unfortunately, we have to put a cap on the amount that we can spend from the fund, because we have so many victims in Denver. We have about 26% of the violent crime that goes on in the state of Colorado goes on in the smallest judicial district in the state, and that's Denver. So we are very busy. Linda only has 2 people that help her, but she also has a board, and that's all set up by statute. But the board then will review those tough cases where it's just not automatic, where we can make that kind of a payout. Mm-hmm. But then what happens is that oftentimes the defendant then is ordered to pay restitution at the end. So not only the fee that goes into the victim's comp, but also restitution. A lot of our violent offenders don't ever pay restitution because they go to the penitentiary. And sometimes it's a condition of parole, sometimes it's a condition of probation. But it's almost like getting blood out of a rock sometimes. Mm-hmm. And sometimes this victim's comp fund is the only resources that are going directly to pay and help those bills. These victims are not getting these checks. They are not getting money or making money off of being a victim of crime. What we're trying to do is make sure that their lives aren't ruined by the bills that are run up by being a victim of crime. So it's a very good system. We have a board where we appoint 3 people, and they get term limited. like so many people do these days. It works well. It's a really good system. Victims are often very upset, and sometimes they're upset with Linda and what we can do and what our limits are. But if we didn't have limits, the fund would run out, and then the next group of victims wouldn't get anything. So it's very important that we have this. And you know, like I say, I think Linda's one of the hardest working people in my office. She's there all the time. I leave at 7:30 at night. Linda's there. I can't tell you how much work she does on the weekends because, you know, I don't come in that much on the weekends anymore. I used to all the time when I was a trial deputy, but I don't think people really understand that every judicial district has someone like Linda that really works hard for victims. Sometimes has to tell them no, sometimes what we tell them upsets them, but to have someone like her doing what she's done for as long as she has for the people of Denver, just amazing to me, and I consider myself lucky having her.
And I imagine you don't want the person to be victimized again, say if their car was stolen or damaged and that was their only way to get to work. Now they might lose their job because they can't fix their car.
Right. We wouldn't be able to assist with the car because we can only help with the crime against person, but we could usually make referrals to folks who can help with transportation if that becomes an issue.
Sure. So Andi, tell me your role with the Department of Justice and how that works.
Sure. Well, I work for the Colorado Division of Criminal Justice, and I am the Victims' Rights Act Specialist there in the Office for Victim Programs. And so in my job, I do a couple different things. First of all, I do a lot of training around the state to criminal justice agencies on what victims' rights is and what are the agency's responsibilities under the statute. And I also talk to a lot of victims around the state who feel like they haven't been afforded their rights. And so I talk to them about whether or not they're covered under the statute. They're a crime against person, again, as the Victims' Rights Act says it's for victims who are victims of crime against person. So we try to determine whether or not the statute applies to them, whether or not their concerns are issues that the statute could speak to, and then what agency is it that they're frustrated with or that they have concerns with. And so I work with the victim and the agency and try to come up with kind of an informal resolution to their concerns. And if that's not possible, and in some cases it's just not possible to resolve their concerns, then they file a complaint, a victim's rights complaint. And so I work with the victim through the complaint process, and I also work with the agency through the complaint process. I take a very neutral role in the complaint process.
So then who makes the decision as to whether or not this person will be compensated? Is that your team? Or?
Right, so if a victim files a complaint, it's the Victims' Rights Act subcommittee, and that's a 7-member subcommittee that determines whether or not there's been a Victims' Rights Act violation. And so there really isn't any compensation to the victim in terms of financial compensation to the victim if there's a violation. However, our goal is to identify if there's a problem in the criminal justice system in providing victims their rights. And if there is a problem, and if it turns out there is a violation, then we want to work with the agency in fixing whatever was broken to ensure that future victims receive their rights.
And so you mentioned something interesting too, that the other side of the coin is that you'll also make sure that the agency is not being taken advantage of, for lack of a better term.
Right. So we take a very neutral role in the compliance process for the victim's rights. And in doing so, we work with the agency, we work with the victim in compiling the information that's relevant to the complaint, and then looking at it from a very neutral standpoint and determining whether or not there's been a violation. And again, if there is, it's not a punitive process. There's no fine against the agency. We're just trying to identify how we can improve the criminal justice system and the way that the members of the system work with victims.
So what happens is sometimes there's what's defined as critical stages in a criminal prosecution. And it may start at the beginning before we're involved. It's actually the police. And they have certain responsibilities under the Victims' Rights Act. And then when we take over the case, we have certain responsibilities. And one of those things is just notifying the victim of what's going on. You know, a critical stage is a preliminary hearing. so they know where the preliminary hearing is, they know when it's going to be, that kind of thing. Some of the things are pretty easy to take care of. You send a letter to the victim. But we have victims that don't have addresses. So we have to go above and beyond that. And so when we'll get a violation, for instance, I may have a young deputy that has plea bargained or disposed of a case through a plea. Somebody's found guilty, and they didn't notify the victim of what they were doing. You know, we have these massive caseloads, and I'm not making excuses for them, but on occasion, they don't get the message to the victim about what happened to their case, what happened to that case where they were the victim of a crime against person. And then they may contact the department and say, you know, this happened to me, and the DA didn't do their job under the Victims' Rights Amendment. And then they'll look into it, and I guarantee you, we look into it, and we try to determine what happened and where there was a breakdown, if there was a breakdown, and then we'll take remedial steps with it. And it might be training, and it might be that we make the deputy train other deputies about the mistake that they made, and not in the terms of a punishment and I made this mistake, but more about this is the issue, this is what we need to consider, and this is important. The good news is we don't get a lot of these. The ones that we do get sometimes don't even apply to the victim. They're not a victim of the kind of crime that would be covered. But what we try to do even in those situations is at least keep our victims notified of what's going on, give them a right to be heard, treat them with dignity and respect. You know, in Colorado, they don't call the shot. It's not their case. They're a witness. They can't say, oh, I don't want you to prosecute. And domestic violence, oftentimes that's what we're being told. But we may have a victim that's not happy with us or not happy with what we're doing. But what we want to try our best to do is make sure they know what's going on, why we're doing what we're doing, and that they're treated with dignity and respect in our aspect of the criminal justice system. Then if we get a conviction, there's an appeal. The Attorney General has a role that they play as part of doing the appeal. So we all have responsibilities, including the judges, under this important amendment to our Constitution to protect victims and make sure that victims are treated with dignity and respect in our system.
Are there programs like this within all of the DA's office throughout the state?
Every judicial district has a victims comp board. Everyone has a veil board. We all have these. They're set up all through as part of the statutes that came into play when the Victim Acts Right, when the Constitution got amended. These are all statutes then that come into play. And I can tell you almost every legislative session, in fact this past one, Linda was up there tinkering with the language, making sure that we were okay with changes or suggesting changes. All those things are important. This is an ongoing process. This is something that we learn from, and it's something that we then try to move forward and make sure that victims are treated better than maybe they were a year ago, 5 years ago, and I guarantee you 20 years ago, because I was here 20 years ago and I watched how judges treated victims, and I watched sometimes how prosecutors in other jurisdictions treated victims. I think that in Denver we were lucky. Dale Tooley, Norm Murley, Bill Ritter were all committed to this. I think that it is the law in Colorado due in large part to those men. And it's something that we work daily on. And I've got people in my office that's all they do. And they are victim advocates that are committed to victims. Linda, same thing. We don't want to violate this act. We do sometimes, and then we try to remedy it when we do.
At least there's a process to fix it if it's broken. We're getting back our guests here talking about victims' compensation. Just before the break, we were talking about whether or not there are other agencies, other DA's offices throughout the state who have victims' compensation, and they do. And so that's primarily your role, Andi, is not only dealing with the DA's office, but all the DA's offices throughout the state, right?
Right. So there are a number of criminal justice agencies throughout the state that have responsibilities or obligations under the Victims' Rights Act. And so that would start from law enforcement agencies up through the district attorney's office and correctional agencies like the Department of Corrections, youth corrections, probation, the Attorney General's office. So throughout the criminal justice system, these agencies have responsibilities under the Victims' Rights Act. And so those responsibilities, as Mitch mentioned before, is to help victims know what's going on in their case, so be informed. And also victims can be present during stages of their case, and victims can be heard at certain junctures of their case. So informed, present, and heard really encompasses what the Victims' Rights Act is all about. And part of being informed is being informed about what financial assistance may be available to them. So in every judicial district, they have the Victims' Compensation Office, such as where Linda works in Denver. And victims' compensation is one of the financial assistance forms that victims can apply for. And there's other opportunities out there for victims, but victims' compensation really is in every judicial district. Victims can apply, and that can be so helpful to victims of all sorts of crimes for all sorts of reasons.
And you talked about the training that you do as well. Tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. Well, I typically train district attorneys' offices and law enforcement agencies about victims' rights and what their agencies are responsible for in terms of providing victims with notification of what's going on in their case. So notice of the case status, for example, or of hearings that are coming up. And not only notice of the hearings, but if the victim has the right to attend and be heard at that hearing, to let the victim know that as well. So the district attorney's office, they oftentimes let victims know not only this hearing is coming up, but you can attend, and this is a hearing where you have the right to be heard, such as when the court considers whether or not to modify the defendant's bond. So the victim may have an opinion about the defendant's bond that might impact their safety, the victim's safety. So the victim might want to address the judge regarding the bond. Or at sentencing, the victim may want to provide a victim impact statement. So the district attorney's offices around the state, they let victims know the hearing is coming up and you have the right to be heard, and they help the victim talk to the judge to say, Judge, the victim is here and would like to address the court regarding the sentence. And that's the district attorney's office has so many responsibilities under the Victims' Rights Act. As for law enforcement, a lot of that is providing victims notice of what kind of assistance is available to them, like victims' compensation or other community agency assistance, like counseling referrals, and also to let the victim know what's going on in their case. So is this an open investigation? Has this case been turned over to the district attorney's office for prosecution? Has this case been closed because it's unfounded or they can't proceed with any investigation? So letting victims know. We don't ever want a victim to not know what's going on in their case and then find out years later that it was closed. That could be just really discouraging for victims to not know what's going on.
And so it's not just about compensation. You're really an advocate for the victim, because without this, the victim would have to go through what the court docket and figure out, what we reporters do all the time, trying to get all this information, which can be not only laborious, but maybe emotional too.
Absolutely. Colorado has a great system of victim advocates. So we have victim advocates from the beginning of the case to the end, from law enforcement to district attorney to probation to the Department of Corrections, letting victims know, here's what's going on, here's who you need to talk to if you have questions, here's the case report number, right? Which seems like such an easy thing to have, but in reality, if nobody gives it to you, how are you going to find out what it is? So the case report number and phone numbers for assisting agencies. So really, there are victim advocates throughout the criminal justice system, and we're very fortunate in Colorado to have such a wonderful support for crime victims. And so I work a lot with those victim advocates and training them, and working with victims myself in terms of them feeling like they haven't been provided their rights, and kind of being a liaison between the victim and the agency and determining, well, what can we do to fix that?
Right now we have an issue going on in Denver. The public defenders, the state public defender has sued one of our judges. And because our judges, the setting of bond, unlike the modification of bond, is not a critical stage where the victim has to be notified and brought in, and specifically was not made part of that. Some victims wanted that. And so the public defenders have figured out that that is not a place where the victim will be there. And in these types of crime, they are asking to be heard at a hearing that is not an adversarial hearing. And they want to make an argument that the bond be set lower than, say, our schedule would be for that crime. Now remember, this is before the case has even been filed.
Right.
And so the judges don't let them do that, and they are now suing the judge as a result of that, our chief judge of the county court, saying, oh, we have a right to be heard at this hearing. They don't. It's not an adversary, it's setting a bond. And the problem with them then coming in and making a pitch to have bond set much lower or that type of thing is the victim's voice is not heard. The victim can't be there for that because they specifically did not make that a critical stage. So what will end up happening is, I assume, if the judge loses the lawsuit, then we'll go into the legislature and we will make it a critical stage, and then it'll be another responsibility for us, and we don't mind it, but the victim needs to be heard, important things like that. And so they found a way to get in without notification of the victim, and of course they have no responsibility when it comes to notifying victims, and they try to get bonds set so low that then that could have a very negative impact on a victim, especially a victim of domestic violence, a victim that then might face this guy out in the community, that type of thing. So right now there is an issue raging in our community about victims' rights, and the judges have a responsibility, and one of the positions that the city is taking, that the judge is taking, is that the victim doesn't know what's going on here, and we are not going to have you be heard now because the victim's voice isn't being heard.
And so let's talk about what are some of those rights. I mean, we've talked about that they have rights, that they have the opportunity to get compensation under certain circumstances. Linda, can you give us a list of a few more?
Yeah, the basic rights, and Andi can help me out here if I'm wrong, are to be treated with fairness, respect, and dignity, to be notified of what are critical stages in the trial or in the investigation of a case, and to be told when they are able to speak in court. They also have the right to be consulted, as Mitch indicated, by the district attorney if a plea agreement offer is being contemplated, that kind of thing. The point of having victim advocates within each DA's office is in part to ensure that each step along the way there's someone who can advise the victim. Sometimes it's just translating the jargon of the system into language someone who is not familiar with the system can understand, and to make sure the victim is able to prepare and predict for the next step, and to navigate their way through what might be unfamiliar territory. The victim advocates generally have numerous phone calls with the victim. They make themselves available to, in part to prevent Andi getting a complaint about our office, but because it's the right thing to do. And for so many years, as again Mitch indicated, victims weren't part of this system. Their voices weren't heard.
And I think we were talking during the break, the first victim advocate was back in 1982, the first...
Dale Tooley really
Tooley, right.
started hiring victim advocates. He didn't really have a budget for it, so I think he had one for the entire district court, which is, you know, the major place where we have crimes against persons. Norm Early really pushed this whole thing, and then you saw victims' comp come into play in the 80s, and then in the 90s is really when we started to do all of the things around notification and treating victims with dignity and respect. I can tell you, I remember doing dockets where we told the judge, listen, the victim is coming down the hall. Well, I'm not waiting. I'm go ahead and do the hearing. And you know, a murder case where a victim's family is running a few minutes late and a judge is going to slow down his docket so he's not going to hear it. And so he got to redo that hearing because he was violating the victim's rights. And that was in the 90s. So we had some old-time judges that kind of gave us a lot of pushback on that. But I think now everybody understands that. And for instance, I've had situations where judges have bright line rules. And you say, well, Judge, today I know is the day that we have to have this case resolved or we're going to trial. But the defense has come to me with what I believe is a reasonable disposition. But of course, today's the day they came to me, and I haven't had the opportunity to sit down with the victim's mother and talk to her about this.
Right.
So could I have 2 weeks? Could I have at least a month? The victim's out of state. the defendant's willing to waive their speedy trial? Could we have a continuance of your bright line so we can be in compliance here and make sure this family knows what's going on here? You know, the one thing that I always talk to my deputies about is, well, what is the disposition here? You know, have they come with something that this family would say, you turned that down? That's something that we would have been in full support of had we known about it.
Right.
So we try to be realistic, and we try to make sure that the victim understands that. And I've seen some very strict judges go, you're right, Mr. Morrissey, you're entitled to a continuance here because the victim has a right to know.
Well, thank goodness it's there. That's an important part of the whole judicial system. Thank you all for being here on this really important topic. Thank you to Crime Victim Compensation Director Linda Ferry and to Andi Martin with the Colorado Division of Criminal Justice for being our guest today with Mitch Morrissey, our Denver D.A. It's a very important tool, and thank you so much for your time. Thanks for joining us on this edition of Dialogue Denver D.A. I'm Tamara Banks, so we'll see you again.